Thank you very much. Let me first explain a little bit from what perspective I'm going to talk about supervision and governance in a complex society. Because I'm, you could say, neither a practitioner nor an academic, or an academic and a practitioner. So I will take the latter perspective today. And indeed, my background in academics is that I did a PhD on uncertainty and a monetary economy. And in that process, stumbled on complexity. And it never left me after that. And the world was never the same after that. That was in the late 80s. And since April this year, I have a 1/5 chair in the complexity of financial markets and financial institutions at Groningen University. So that's the academic side. Then the practitioner side is basically twofold. I've been at the Dutch Central Bank several phases of my career, been a policymaker in that capacity. And nowadays, I'm also a supervisor, be it an internal supervisor at LCH ClearNet, which is an international large central counterparty clearing all kinds of financial and also non-financial transactions. So I'd like to talk to you indeed from different perspectives, and the risk that I run is that I will be incoherent. So I try to avoid that, but you may judge yourself that I was successful, because I think I have to tell something, both to the practitioners here and the academics, and to give away, let's say, the plot and the message immediately, so that it doesn't get lost in my further thoughts. I think that the message is that people who have to govern a system, or to have to supervise a system, a firm, a complex system, a firm, and a firm is already complex, and an economy is complex, and a financial system is complex. I think the practitioners really can benefit a lot from stimulating research from the complexity perspective. And they can really benefit, I think, from engaging with people working in that field and stimulating research in that field. So that's to the practitioners. And then to the academics, I think, who are the majority here today. From whatever science you are, please, I would say, turn to macroeconomics from the perspective of supervision and governance, because the field is wide open for all kinds of interesting questions to deal with. You would benefit us a lot, yourself a lot, and society a lot by doing that. Mainstream macroeconomics, which provides the background at the moment for, let's say, many of the policy-oriented work and the work supporting supervision, mainstream macroeconomics has two serious flaws. And the first one is that it is, let me put it very bluntly but clearly, it's inconsistent. Because it doesn't take into account uncertainty. And in economics, I noticed that today we grapple with, let's say, meaning of terms. And I think that's something that's very interesting to note. And I think we should take it also into account when designing the research program. The meaning of words is, although we are talking about the same, is slightly, and perhaps sometimes even more than slightly different. And we have to work on that, to make that more precise. But in economics, there's an important distinction between what we call uncertainty and risk. Risk is a situation where you can apply probability theory, where you can calculate. Uncertainty is a situation where that is not possible, because the number of potential outcomes of a certain action, the consequences of a certain action, cannot be known. You cannot have a full list of all the actions. And if you think a little bit, many of the decisions that you have to take in economic policy and in supervising a financial system or an economic system are more characterized by uncertainty than by risk. And the point is that this uncertainty cannot be removed. It's an inescapable element of our existence. And it matters. And it matters. If you include uncertainty in your model or in your way of looking at the world, a number of things become important that are irrelevant in the traditional economic models. And that's things like ethics, norms, history, institutions, the legal system, but also, and you may be surprised if you're not an economist, money and finance. If you take the traditional economic model, and if you have only risk in the model, you can prove, and it has been proved already long ago, that money and finance are irrelevant. Money and finance are irrelevant. It's interesting, isn't it? Taking into account what happened in 2007, 2008. I'll come back to that. But that's the first flaw. The second flaw, more directly related to what we are discussing today, is the issue of macro. We have macroeconomics, I called it macroeconomics, but something terrible has happened, let me put it that way. In the 1930s, macroeconomics was developed, and at that time, it was a real macro theory. And this has degenerated into what I would call a theory in which macro is aggregated micro only. So current macroeconomics has no emergent behavior and is not really a macro theory. It assumes the existence of representative agents. So we have one consumer who is supposed to be representing all the consumers, and we suppose that the aggregate is just 500 million or whatever the size of the country is, times that representative agent. And it thereby ignores, clearly, I think I don't have to explain it at least to the academics here, that the economy, the financial system, banks, financial institutions are complex. But now the interesting thing is, in economics, this idea of complexity has not been reinvented very recently. It has, but it has existed for quite some time. But it has moved to the fringes of economics, out of the mainstream. And the way I have discovered complexity in economics is through what I would argue the father of complexity in economics is Friedrich von Hayek. And I think he has defined complexity in an economic system in a way I think that is fruitful for looking at economic financial systems. In his way, in his definition, an economic system, or any system, is complex. It should be a social system probably, is complex if it is impossible to collect all the data that you would need to describe the state of that system at any point, any central point, at any moment. And he arrived at this characteristic of the social and economic system in the 30s, when there was this discussion on whether a centrally planned economy wouldn't work better than a decentralized market economy. And von Hayek was the great defender of the market system. because it was able to deal with all this dispersed information that in his view could not be centralized. So a central planner simply wouldn't have the data that he would need to have to be able to do the planning. And he criticized economics at that time that said, well, let's assume that we have the data, the preferences of the people, the technology that we use. How do we allocate resources given those data? But he said the economic problem is not to do that, but the point is, how can an economy where nobody has all the data still provide a coordinated outcome? And that's later here, in '67, he translated that very clearly in an article that was called The Theory of Complex Phenomena. And his fascination was how it is possible that such a decentralized, such a complex system can be so stable. That's interesting. And even for Keynes, as you know, the father of modern macroeconomics, who dealt, of course, with the consequences of instability in the 30s, he in his great work, also raises the same question, that perhaps he should be more surprised that such a system is stable rather than unstable. So that's how I look at complexity, and these are the two flaws in modern macroeconomics, and then also in the basis of looking at economic policy, at supervision of economic systems, financial systems. Mainstream economics describes what I would call simple systems, and thereby it also has, that's also important, it has the pretense to offer policymakers a tool for control and prediction. It's clearly the pretense. Economics wants to be a science which has the pretense to be able to forecast and control in rather great detail. Financial supervision was based on the assumption that if individual institutions, individual banks, it would be sound, that then automatically, as it were, the question didn't even arise, that then automatically the system as a whole, the economy as a whole, and the financial system as a whole would be stable. If you want to describe the policy framework, let's say over the past 30 years or so, this was a very important element in it. We focus on individual institutions, we ensure that the individual institutions are stable, then the overall system is stable. And then the financial crisis of 2007, 2008 struck. I think if we want to apply, let's say, complexity theory to the development of, in this case, macroeconomics or economics as a science, I think which is a very interesting thing to do. This was a clear threshold. It is, as it were, a point where it became clear that this way of modeling the world, of looking at the world, was insufficient. Not just to, not to be able to forecast what happened, but not even having the tools to really describe what had happened. I recall myself vividly, and I cannot talk about that for too long, but to make it clear, that now with hindsight, if we look at what has happened since the 60s or 70s, that is a period which I, again with hindsight, now characterize as the great financial expansion. There has been a revolution in the size of the financial sector relative to the rest of the economy. And just to mention one figure to make that clear. In 1980, When I joined the Dutch Central Bank, one of the things I had to look at was the balance of payments, so our transactions of the Netherlands with foreign countries. And in the balance of payments, you make a distinction between so-called real transactions, so exports of goods and services. On the one hand, the real economy and the financial sector. So financing of those transactions. In the 1980s, you looked at the flows in and out of our country. The gross flows in the real sphere and in the financial sphere were more or less identical. 2 years ago, I gave a presentation at the Dutch Central Bank about what has happened, about this great financial expansion. And then I said, well, nowadays, of course, these financial flows are a manifold of the real flows. And then somebody rapidly calculated it and sent me an email, so I saw it in front of me. It's now between 20 and 25 times the real economy. And then you have to think about, will it have an impact on the way the economy functions? I think it has had an enormous influence over these 30 years. Causalities have really have changed dramatically. Again, exaggerating a little bit for lack of time to be more precise, but you could argue that in the 60s, 70s, the real sector caused what happened in the financial sector. The financial sector was passive, financed what was happening in the real sector. Nowadays, the motives of those who decide on financial flows determine the outcome. For instance, if many people think it's interesting to invest in the US, money flows into the US, drives up the exchange rate of the dollar, and thereby reduces competitiveness of the US, and that reduces then exports. So my story now starts with the motives in the financial sector, and then in the end, it results in a certain outcome in the real sector. And that, of course, is a shock to a model in which finance is not relevant, in which in the end, indeed, the mainstream macro model is driven by decisions in the real sector of the economy. So the result of this not taking into account uncertainty, which leads to money and finance and even markets to be relevant, was clearly having an impact on the relevance of mainstream macroeconomics. But it was hidden for a long time because the outcome, ironically, of the economic process over the past 30 years led to the view that we really were in control. Things went very well. Inflation came down, economy was very stable. And then this happens in waves in economics. We have had such periods before. And you know that then a structural break is around the corner most of the time. If you know history, but not many people know history. So it was a very, we saw articles of the science of monetary policy. You see articles where economists claim that they now indeed control the world. And then it's 2007, 2008, and it was clearly demonstrated, and it was a trigger point. It was clear demonstration of the interconnectedness of the financial system, and that it mattered a lot, that it was very relevant for understanding what was happening. And it has led in economics, indeed, I think, to what might become a paradigm shift. But in any case, that there's a lot of exciting work going on, trying to repair the flaws in economics. That's in a part building on, let's say, the existing theory. But here, I think the door is wide open. Somebody have already gone through that door but I said I invite more people to do that, is wide open to look at the economic system and to policy issues and governance issues, but more widely at an economic system through the analytical framework of complexity theory. It's not only in let's say, in academic economics that conclusions were drawn that opened this door. It's also in policy. I said the assumption before the crisis was that you only need micro supervision, let me call it that way, only looking at individual institutions. Worldwide, the conclusion has been drawn up to the level of the G20, so even the politicians have subscribed to this conclusion that we need what are now called macroprudential policies, or macroprudential supervision, which stands for looking at the financial system as a whole and having policies to contribute to promote the stability of the system as a whole. That was a nice conclusion. But so far, at that point, the emperor had very little clothes on, because such policies have to be built up from scratch. If you look at, for instance, other policies in economics, monetary policy. For monetary policy, you have a very clear framework. You have an objective, you have an instrument, you have an institution that has to take care of it, you have a governance structure, you have accountability, and you have an underlying economic theory and underlying analytical framework. All these things had to be developed and still are in the process of being developed for macroprudential policies. So, as said, a lot of work is being done in the mainstream framework. A lot of work is also being promoted, let's say, in the non-mainstream that already emphasize, for instance, uncertainty. But as said, for me, complexity theory is a clear alternative, and I don't have to point out the reasons here to this audience, perhaps to some of the practitioners. So it can deal with heterogeneity. It can deal with interconnectedness. That's the core of the theory. It offers a tool for developing concepts, a different language, a different perspective, and it matters. It really matters. You look at other things. And let me mention a couple of examples, and I think a number of them were already mentioned by Roland before the break, perhaps something in a slightly different context. But for instance, one thing where I think thinking has to be radically different, and starts to be radically different, is that we have to move from diversification to diversity. In the traditional economic theory, also in investment theory, portfolio theory, it is very important for your portfolio that it is diversified. But this theory is a micro theory. So it looks at the portfolio of an individual bank, pension fund, individual. Well, and indeed you can show that in not putting all your eggs in one basket, as it is usually said, is helpful if you look at it at the individual level. But again, for this audience, if you have, and I'm now deliberately exaggerating, but it's one of the interesting questions is, to what extent am I really exaggerating? I would be very interested in having analysis and research on that area. What happens if we have an economy, and again I exaggerate, where all the firms use exactly the same risk framework, have exactly the same portfolio, A worldwide, very much diversified portfolio, but very much the same. So that we have indeed identical firms, and that indeed the theory of the representative firm holds. But what does it mean for the system? Again, this is likely to be a very fragile system. And my hypothesis, let me open the door for further research and for this being challenged, that over time, it may well be that indeed the economic system became very much more diversified, but at the same time far less diverse. And that this is one of so that the fragility of the system has grown very strongly over time. But it's an interesting issue for research, but in terms of language and focus, this has already been quite a change. I was discussing changes in perception, and that it really matters if you adopt a complexity framework. I mentioned the importance of buffers or redundancy, if you would like to put a more general term. The interesting thing is, if you look, let's say, at capacity utilization in economies over time, even in the very good times, there are very few economies that have a capacity utilization that goes beyond 85%. So redundancy is a characteristic of a normal economic system. But there was in traditional theory, there's not much eye for it. And indeed, there is a kind of a trade-off between efficiency and redundancy. But certainly in the run-up to the crisis, this was not perceived as a trade-off. The objective was maximum efficiency and make your buffers as small as possible. And looking in the complexity framework shows that buffers may be important because they create response time. They create response time. Risk management, there I'm a little bit more concerned that the lessons have already been learned. As you all know, at the moment, we are in the process in Europe of creating a banking union. So that means that supervision will be centralized at the European Central Bank. And the European Central Bank is now hiring supervisors. They need 800 supervisors. And of course, they have also to think about how are we going to supervise these 130, a little bit less, banks. And they are now recruiting people, and they argue that people with experience in risk management have a plus behind their name. I think maybe, but here again we may have an example of trying to win the past war. Because as said, in economic systems and also at firm level, it's not about risk, it's about uncertainty. And that's why I also mention this uncertainty in combination with complexity. Because I hope that we will have academics who not only will use, let's say, the complexity framework and apply that to the maximum extent possible to economic system issues, but that they take into account this uncertainty at the inescapable uncertainty. And then, why is this uncertainty inescapable? Let me put it that way. Because I think it's a logical argument. The first argument is that we cannot know what we will discover, let's say, 10 years from now, by definition. If we would know it, it would not be a discovery. So we cannot know what we will discover in 10 years' time. If you take decisions, for instance, an investment decision, you will sometimes have horizons that go well beyond 10 years, maybe 20 years, 30 years. So the consequences of the decision today are, by definition, influenced by things that you cannot know. So we have to deal with that uncertainty. And the good news is that this is not new. We have done that for ages. And we have we found certain responses for dealing with that. So focusing on how to deal with a complex and uncertain system, I think should be high on the agenda. So let me elaborate that a little bit. How would all this fit into, let's say, a program which has as a title "Getting to Grips with Complexity"? I would say wonderfully to start with, but I see two elements in that program, and I very much hope that both of the elements will be there. I'm not so interested in whether people will focus on certain detailed questions rather than others. My view has always been, I've been managing research departments in my life in the past. What I found important and where I hope that I would create the best opportunities for getting the results that you can, alas, never predict, is to create the right conditions and setting, let's say, very broad objectives and kind of framework of what against what background you are doing the research. Both, let's say, in the real world, what I'm doing now, trying to tell you why it is interesting to look into this issue from the perspective where you are working on. And on the other hand, so that's one element. And then the other element is then, of course, it has to fit in what's going on in the scientific community. And the ones who know best are you yourself. So I think it's the best way to in the end, arrive at a good research program is to have a good general background, have a rather general definition of what you want to do, and then let the machine run. And something else, but I will tell at the end. So I'm very happy with this, with the title "Grip on Complexity." But again, here it is important to think about what we mean. Again, there may be different meanings, and that's not a problem because that may also be an engine that drives us forward. But I see two elements if I look at it from the economic questions that we have to grapple with. First of all, I'm indeed interested in to what extent can an economic system or a complex system be expected to self-regulate it, to regulate itself, to organize itself, to create a spontaneous order. What kind of order is it? Can we, from a policy point of view, can we influence that order? And how can we do that? And what are the boundaries of what we can do in that area? Because there the second point comes in, and there my remarks about uncertainty come in. There are clear limits to predictability, controllability, provided by that fundamental uncertainty. So the second part of the agenda should be that I hope at least, that there are people who say, well, I'd like to dig deeper in how do we deal with complexity and uncertainty. And as said, we have done that for ages. Institutions are a response to uncertainty. At least that's one theory. Money, for instance, is an institution that provides you with the option not to commit yourself, to keep your options open to unforeseen circumstances, and then to respond quickly. That's the economic function of money and liquidity, and which makes it in the end important. So that's one thing. A further thing is that I think we have to. I would like, let me put it again in that way. I would like to have very diverse project, not only with people with a different background. I love mathematicians in dealing with these economic issues, and the model cannot be mathematically enough to my liking. Also, people from biology, all kinds of disciplines, so different disciplines, and also diversity in the level of abstraction. I think there are, for economics, as said, while we are in terms of governance, grappling with the framework, so all the very abstract questions that I mentioned earlier, having contributions there, I think is welcome, and more than welcome. And it's also true that I know from, at least for economic history, that even if you try to target your research at certain very concrete questions, history tells me, at least in economic policy, that the biggest leaps forward often come from research that started out very abstract and very general, and then all of a sudden there was a contribution in all kinds of areas. So yes, also abstract, very abstract research, but I think it is very welcome at the moment for economics. There are very concrete questions to be answered. Let me, in the area of supervision, mention just a few questions. Will the financial system become more stable if we have a cap on the size of a bank? Will the financial system become more stable if we would make a distinction between savings banks and investment banks? Then you have all kinds of more structural measures that are being taken in the US, the so-called Volcker rule. You have the Vickers rule in the United Kingdom, and we have the Liikanen rule in Europe. Analyze those rules and tell me whether it helps me to create a stable system or not, and under what conditions. I think this is a wonderful world. And I would even be more happy if you could tell me, because that's a personal interest. I mentioned that I was at the LCH Clearnet, the central counterparty. One of the measures after the financial crisis has been to concentrate all the clearing of financial transactions in central counterparties. So all these huge derivatives markets run now through central clearing parties. So you concentrate risks, you create a high level of interconnectedness through these central counterparties. Is this the right way? Under what conditions? Please help, I would argue. A few final remarks, because I'm running. Peter is getting a little bit nervous. But a few things that I'd still like to say. If you, and again, I'd like to have this idea of uncertainty in it. And as I told you earlier, I've been dealing with that issue since the early 1980s. And the response that you get from policymakers and academics working in the mainstream is twofold on this uncertainty. If I make the logical argument, there are quite a number of people say, well, you may be right. But the first thing they say, well, is it relevant? Then I try to explain why I think it's highly relevant, not only for how an economy functions, but also for the methodology of academic research. Then their response is try to make the unmeasurable measurable. So try to turn uncertainty into risk somehow. This ends in high frustration, because it is by definition impossible. And the second response is to turn away in despair. I think, and that's a pity, because as I said, I think we have been grappling with this for ages, and we have managed to create or to arrive at economic systems that were both able to grow very rapidly and to be on balance very stable. As I said, the fascination should perhaps be more with the stability rather than the instability. And how did we stumble on the approach of being able to do that? So here we have to move, because I mentioned somewhere the ECB and banking supervision. Here we have to move beyond what I would call traditional risk management and starting to think about how do we deal with a complex and uncertain financial system, and how do we promote, contribute to its stability. I think it would be important, two final remarks. I think it is important that we take into account, if we go that road and indeed revive, as it were, complexity and uncertainty in economics, more than it has been already done the past few years, we have to be aware of the earlier contributors. That is Keynes himself, who created macroeconomics in the end, but whose message, in my view, really has been lost. That is Hayek, that is Schumpeter, because you start about the evolution of a dynamic complex system. It's an open system, and there are different models for change: revolution, evolution, dialectic change, and creative destruction a la Schumpeter. Perhaps there are more models, but thinking about financial complex economic systems without that, I think, is important. Final remark, listening again to the, I think, very interesting exchange of views that we have today. I think in the program, I think it's not just a matter of selecting a number of projects that we hope are the most powerful. But my feeling is that with this framework of complexity, and I know that this has started 20, 30 years ago in Santa Fe, perhaps, but it still has a lot of potential to develop. And the potential that it has is to indeed to not only create a new paradigm, but also to change, let's say, the network of scientists. It offers the opportunity of people to connect with each other who were really operating in very different fields. And that's now we can remove the barriers. And to a certain extent that has already happened, and it is happening. But I think we should give it a little push by thinking about how we can apply, I would almost say apply network theory to developing a process where you interconnect academics from different fields, create awareness, help to build a common language. I found a discussion about the meaning of things. I think this is very relevant and important to continue to do that. Build a new network, a community, whatever you call it. And I think it is important, and that's to the practitioners, but also to the academics, that they engage in this network, that they are part of that network, link themselves in this to this community. And I think we have to find a way to make that a part of the program. And if we do that, I think wonderful things can happen and grow. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the wonderful contribution.